Just across the river, there used to be tons of caribous, like hundreds, but there's no more caribous. We can hardly see them anymore.
Now the salt water is a lot warmer and the fish go deeper, deeper sea. So we're getting hardly to get fish now.
When I was a kid, my grandmother used to tell me someday there will be no snow. I didn't believe what she had told me, but some predictions had already come true.
Climate change and its effect on culture around the world. Climate change is defined as a long-term change in the Earth's climate, especially a change due to an increase in the average atmospheric temperature. The Earth's climate is always changing, but in the past century or so, the average global temperature has increased drastically and rapidly over time, which is what we call global warming. Global warming is mostly attributed to the greenhouse effect, which is where heat from the sun is trapped in the lower atmosphere because of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The 6 main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, chlorofluorocarbons, nitrous oxide, and ozone in the troposphere. Chlorofluorocarbons are only man-made, but all of the other 5 greenhouse gases are both naturally made and human-made. There are basically 6 main steps to the greenhouse effect. So the first thing that happens is that solar radiation reaches the Earth's atmosphere, and some of this is reflected back into space. That's normal. And then step 2 is that the rest of the sun's energy is absorbed by land and oceans heating the Earth. Again, normal. Step 3 is that the heat radiates from the Earth towards space. Step 4, some of this heat is trapped by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, keeping Earth warm enough to sustain life. Step 5 is that human activities, such as burning fossil fuels, agriculture, and land clearing, increase the amount of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere. And step 6 is that these greenhouse gases are trapping that extra heat and causing the Earth's temperature to rise to a greater extent than it should. The top 5 causes of climate change are carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning power plants, carbon dioxide emissions from burning gasoline for transportation, methane emissions from animals, agriculture, such as rice paddies, and from Arctic seabeds, deforestation, especially tropical forests for wood, pulp, and farmland, and an increase in the usage of chemical fertilizers on croplands. In this video, we will mainly be focusing on carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning power plants, methane emissions from animals, agriculture, and Arctic seabeds, and deforestation, especially in tropical forests. Quoted from Newsweek, there is an increasing realization that climate change is more than a scientific artifact. Recently, scientists are starting to look more at the impact of climate change on cultures, on ways of life, and on people. In this video, we'll delve into that connection. The EPA says that climate change could affect our society through impacts on a number of different social, cultural, and natural resources. Now, some groups will face greater challenges than others. Climate change will especially impact people who live in areas that are vulnerable to coastal storms, drought, and sea level rise, or people who are poor. Some types of professions or industries may face large challenges because of climate change as well. Climate change could threaten natural resources as well as the goods and services they produce, and jobs and livelihoods of those who depend on them. An example of this is farming communities, tourism and recreation, and the insurance industry, all industries and communities that depend on natural resources that are at danger by climate change. Communities that are developed around the production of different agricultural crops, such as corn, wheat, or cotton, depend on the climate to support their ways of life. And this climate change, combined with the decreasing rural populations, a changing climate may fundamentally change many of these communities and many of these cultures that exist within these communities. Some of the crops may disappear entirely because of climate change, and if a cultural group relies on that crop for something related to their culture, then that could drastically change that culture negatively. Climate change also affects tourism and recreational activities. The warming climate, plus the changes in precipitation patterns, will decrease the number of days when recreational snow activities can take place. The increasing number of wildfires will affect hiking and recreation in parks, and beaches that suffer erosion due to sea level rise and storm surge will have a great effect on tourism and travel to those specific countries whose beaches are being affected by climate change. Also, changes in migration patterns of fish and animals can affect fishing and hunting of certain communities. And if a culture depends on the activities of fishing and hunting for cultural purposes, again, this climate change is affecting that culture. A source from Education Scotland says that climate has a big effect on the food we eat, the energy we use, the homes we live in, the work we do, and how we travel to work, our culture and heritage, and the way we spend our spare time. A source from Z News India says that there are certain cultural experiences that bring our communities together and are at risk/under threat because of climate change. They give some examples of beaches, winter sports, visiting iconic natural spaces, using traditional methods of agriculture and construction, etc. Climate change is not only affecting natural resources and culture, but it is also affecting the well-being of people. Brookings Institute estimates that for every percentage point rise in average temperature and drop in average rainfall, violent conflict between neighboring states rises 4%, while violent conflict between groups within states climbs 14%. Climate change is also referred to as a threat multiplier because it can speed up the spread of infectious diseases and armed insurgencies. The Brookings Institute also says because of the melting ice caps in the Arctic, new shipping routes are having to be formed, which they see leading to military conflicts. Now let's take a deeper look at how climate change affects urban populations. The EPA states that city residents and urban infrastructure have distinct sensitivities to climate change impacts. An example of this is how heat waves are amplified in cities because of the concentration of asphalt and concrete, and cities therefore absorb more heat during the day than suburban and rural areas. Also, cities are more densely populated. More than 80% of the U.S. population lives in urban areas, and as a result, increases in heat waves, drought, or violent storms in cities would affect larger groups of people. Also, city dwellers are particularly susceptible to vulnerabilities in aging infrastructure. For example, drainage and sewage systems, flood and storm protection assets, transportation systems, and power supply during periods of peak demand. And city dwellers become most vulnerable to these aging infrastructures, these systems during the summer when the heat waves are peaking. Finally, the higher temperatures and more extreme events that come from climate change would affect the cost of energy, air, and water quality, and human comfort and health in urban populations and in cities. The next thing I want to talk about is how climate change affects World Heritage sites around the world and what that means for cultural change. Philip Ross from ibtimes.com states that rising sea levels threaten to drown cultural landmarks like the Sydney Opera House over the next 2 millennia. He says that as climate change accelerates, ice melting and sea levels continue to rise, scientists warn that not only does global warming endanger coastal economies and put entire island nations at risk of disappearing, it also jeopardizes our cultural heritage. Many treasured landmarks, such as the Statue of Liberty, the Sydney Opera House, the Tower of London, the archaeological site of Pompeii, etc., could be ruined if the temperatures rise 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels over the next 2 millennia, and that data was found from the University of Innsbruck in Australia. It was also found that the rise in global temperatures of just over 5 degrees Fahrenheit and the subsequent ice melting in polar zones like Greenland and Antarctica would threaten 20% of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Ben Marzion says that when people think about climate change, most of the time they're thinking about ecological or economic consequences. We thought it would be interesting to add another dimension to that, the cultural implications of climate change. 1/5 of UNESCO's 720 World Heritage Sites would be threatened after 2,000 years of rising sea levels, but first the effects of global warming would be felt much sooner. These landmarks represent culture, they represent history, and when climate change has that negative impact on those cultural areas and makes them at risk of disappearing completely, then that whole culture, that whole way of life is put into danger by climate change. Now, the last thing that I want to look at is how climate change affects indigenous cultures, indigenous groups of people, and the land in which they call home. Greg Downey, in his article, The Culture is Endangered by Climate Change, takes a look at the Sauk way of life, and especially the story of the Bull of Winter, to demonstrate how climate change is directly affecting indigenous groups of people. The Sauk people are noticing that their winters are becoming warmer, bringing more rain and upsetting the hay season that they rely on, culturally and nutritionally. Familiar animals to these people are growing less common and new species are migrating north to their land. Because of the more snowfall, the hunting becomes more difficult in the winter. And when the snow thaws, the water floods their towns, fields, and countrysides, rotting their houses, bogging down farming, and making life more difficult. A quote from one of the Sauk people says, "I have seen 2 Vigote Jill, which is big water years in their language, in my lifetime. One was the big flood in 1959. I remember canoeing down the street to our kin's house. The other is now. The difference is that in 59 the water was only here for a few days, and now it does not seem to be going away." The Bull of Winter is a cultural symbol in the Sauk culture, in the Sauk way of life. And because of the warming winters due to global warming, this symbol is kind of disappearing for these people. And because of that, they're kind of lost. So looking at the Sauk people and some of the stories can really help visualize and help solidify how climate change is really affecting indigenous groups of people. Now let's look at Native Americans. Now, Native Americans are particularly vulnerable because their communities are closely tied to specific reservation boundaries that restrict their ability to relocate to avoid climate change impacts. They have a greater difficulty coping with the impacts of climate change, including those on water resources, agriculture, and ecosystem, because there is a limited opportunity to change their livelihoods, like I said, relocate. The tribes in the Southwest, the Alaskan Natives, they have cultural ties with specific animals that are abundant in their environment. For example, seals and caribou. And those animals will experience changes to their habitats, therefore affecting those populations of animals. So climate change may significantly affect the cultural traditions practiced by these tribes because the animals with which they have cultural ties to may no longer exist. A few more examples of indigenous groups of people that are experiencing this cultural impact of climate change are the Sami. They reindeer herd, and because of the warmer climate that is hitting northern Finland, Sweden, and Norway, they're no longer able to practice that cultural tradition. The Bantu and Khoisan speaking tribes in the bone white Kalahari Basin in the sub-Saharan Africa are experiencing changes to their culture because of their climate, and subsistence communities in Bangladesh and Malaysia whose coastal sediments are at risk of flooding from typhoons, monsoons, and higher sea levels are definitely experiencing a cultural change because of a climate change. The Athabascan people, the Ban Ki-moon people, the Mongolian people, the Iboloi culture, the island cultures in the Torres Strait, and even the Amazon, the cultures, the people, the animals that live in the Amazon are under threat because of climate change, are under cultural threat. The last group of people I want to look at is the Quechua people in the Andes and how this climate change is affecting their culture and is equaling a culture change. Now, the Quechuan people have a very strong tie, very strong worship of the natural elements that have allowed them to survive in their harsh climate. And a specific glacier is central to certain rituals that they perform, and because of the increased temperature, that glacier is disappearing, it's shrinking as we speak. And this is changing their relationship to the environment, with the environment. And like one of the Quechuan people said, climate change is forcing a cultural change. The white Andean peaks that serve as their protective deities are melting and they're shrinking. And this climate change is drastically affecting their culture, their cultural practices, and their ways of life, and the way in which they worship even. So looking at the Quechuan people in the Andes serves as a really good example of how this climate change is equaling a culture change for many groups of indigenous people around the world. Now let's look at some solutions to global climate change. Looking at NASA, there is a difference between personal responsibility and state and nationwide solutions. Personally, you can try and invest in greener sources of energy, so solar energy, water energy, things like that, rather than coal burning or fossil fuel energy. Also, just doing small things like maybe not eating meat or trying to reduce your personal carbon dioxide emissions is a way to solve the problem one step at a time. State and nationwide, there can be things such as carbon taxes, carbon cap and trade systems, renewable energy standards, modified fuel economy standards, an emphasis on greater energy efficiencies, zoning requirements, land use regulations, and even new structures for insurance rates. All of these things are things that you personally can implement, states can implement, and even nations can implement. Things we can agree on to tackle this battle on climate change. And looking at how climate change affects cultures, urban populations, cultures in general, even indigenous cultures, really shows that this is a serious issue that needs to be tackled, and everyone needs to come together, no matter from what walk of life you are from what culture you belong to. We all need to come together and find solutions, find actions that we can take to combat global warming and global climate change.